Welcome to Law and Society. Today we're going to talk about manliness, race, and gender in American politics. So please subscribe and let's get started. Mediocre white men have always had an inferiority complex that has manifested itself as white supremacy. This story begins with European exploration and trade going back centuries. In America, European exploration brought with it captive African people who were used as slaves. Native Americans were savages to the colonialists' eyes. African slaves were not much better in this society. On these black enslaved shoulders, America grew. Generations before America had its revolution in the late 1700s. And even then, neither the Constitution nor the Bill of Rights vested rights upon enslaved Africans or Native Americans. Between 1776, when our founding fathers declared independence from Britain, and the 1860s, African Americans were not citizens. They did not have voting rights. During these 90-odd years, American culture morphed around race politics. While African Americans were not equal under the law, by adopting their enslavers' Christian religion, black people found community by forming their own churches. While they withstood unimaginable cruelties and atrocities at the hands of their enslavers, African American churches became sanctuaries for the African American community. Attending church became a big part of black culture. A tradition of peaceful resistance, and undaunted resilience grew in these black churches. That tradition continues to this day. Black churches remain sanctuaries for the black community. Going back, with the Emancipation Proclamation, followed by the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, black Americans were freed, given equal citizenship, and given the right to vote, overruling Dred Scott, which did not extend American citizenship to African Americans, and which is still considered one of the worst decisions by the Supreme Court. This drastically disrupted the world of mediocre white men had grown accustomed to and comfortable with. Between the late 1700s and the mid 1800s, American white men grew opulent and flamboyant. Victorian culture prevailed in American white society. There were working class white people, but even they adopted the racist practices of the white elites. Native and African American men were considered savages, capable of great strength but lacking in culture and civility. White American society was civilized and it managed savage African slaves by keeping them enslaved and keeping them focused on hard labor. But with these amendments, that social structure became obsolete. Now African Americans could vote, theoretically. They were free and they were equal to white Americans, who enjoyed a superior social standing before the law changed. Of course, white people didn't go quietly and accept their African American brothers and sisters. Racial brutality exploded. African Americans were no longer slaves, and they couldn't be dismissed as savages because they were given equal rights under the law. White men of privilege and white men who benefited from enslaved African Americans could no longer exploit them. The black man was no longer a savage. They had a place in civil society, in civilized society. They were not enslaved into servitude. They could actually break shackles and strive to be something other than plantation workers. And they were physically stronger than their white countrymen. This created an identity crisis among white American men who had embraced Victorian civility and rejected the image of a hard-working, outdoorsy, salt-of-the-earth strongman as prototypically American. Between the late 1800s and the early 1900s, a new image of the typical white man emerged. They liked the outdoors, physical activity, simple lives, obedient wives, and rejected Victorian dandyism and flamboyance. Adopting this ideology didn't automatically mean these white people were racist, but they were playing into a legal and social movement intended to change the perception of American white men to keep up with emerging changes in a multiracial society. The racism that plagued America from its inception didn't go away, though. It went underground, under the guise of separate but equal, thanks to the Supreme Court again in Plessy versus Ferguson. Laws were passed nationwide known now as Jim Crow-era laws that segregated the races, allowing rampant racial discrimination throughout America and throughout institutional systems like public schools. White society largely benefited from and abided by this racial disparity until Brown versus Board of Education ruled that separate but equal does not comply with the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, thereby nullifying all state laws that discriminated on the basis of race. This made it even more difficult for racist white Americans to maintain their superiority. Few other things happened in the early 1900s that seriously threatened the image of the prototypical white American man. And by American, as I said, I mean white. After all, the whole morphing from Victorian flamboyance to the outdoorsy macho man happened to keep up with the African American men who were perceived to be inherently physically stronger. In 1910, when Teddy Roosevelt and others were tacitly nudging American white men to be outdoorsy masculine alpha males, a boxing match between Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries took place in Reno, Nevada. Coined the fight of the century, this boxing match pitted African American Jack Johnson against white American Jim Jeffries. Both were world heavyweight champions. Mr. Jeffries' motivation for the fight was clear. He said he was going into this fight for the sole purpose of proving that a white man is better than, and I quote, a Negro. He failed. Jack Johnson defeated Jim Jeffries in that highly publicized fight. It sparked riots across the country that killed people, and it upended any masculine alpha male image of the white man that Roosevelt and others pushed on American men. Sort of beautiful, ironic thing happens where racism comes out roaring saying, yeah, the white man is superior, and then is defeated resoundingly. And that changes the narrative of how American white masculinity was being built or was being perceived in the world that was no longer white only. Then came World War I. Large American cities that had harbors were flooded by seamen who spent their breaks from deployment in these cities. In New York, military men flooded barrooms and inns in the Bowery in Lower Manhattan. These establishments were also frequented by dandies, men who didn't conform to the alpha male image of the American macho man, some even dressed like women, and who were also sexually attracted to men. Straight white men went to these places, even those in the military, and they were all straight, primarily because the men, who came to be known as wolves, performed the dominant male role while dandies and pansies were receptive, feminine, and submissive. Over the years, harbor cities like San Francisco and New York became hotbeds of gay culture and nightlife. The LGBTQ plus community emerged from this mosh pit of men from around the country congregating in large cities, and women and people who are gender minorities. Because the gay, the LGBT, the lesbian movement includes all sexual minorities who are marginalized. The community's flamboyance threatened, and to this day threatens, white male masculinity as much as any other threat to straight white patriarchy. It is not a coincidence that today's SCOTUS has indicated that it is open to revisiting Obergefell, the case that gave the right to same-sex marriage, as well as going back to revisiting Griswold v. Connecticut to undo substantive due process rights completely. It is not a coincidence that Donald's regime is openly trans, and so far SCOTUS seems to agree with the regime. The third big thing that happened was in 1920 when American women gained the right to vote by way of the 19th Amendment. This diluted the white man's vote even more, a move many white men saw as a disenfranchisement of their right to vote. Women getting the right to vote bolstered the image of a more egalitarian America than the world had ever seen, and America had ever seen. And it would get more so. All these developments were beginnings of civil rights movements for Black Americans, Latin Americans, American women, and LGBTQ plus Americans. The actions of brave women and men who didn't belong to America's white patriarchy showed Americans that all people are created equal. Between the 1950s and 1970s, and for a certain extent, as far as Obergefell in 2015, America expanded its concept of freedom and individual autonomy. From undoing separate but equal through Brown v. Board of Education, to the right to contraception through Griswold v. Connecticut, to the right to a right of a woman to choose whether or not to terminate her pregnancy through Roe v. Wade, to the Voting Rights Act. These 20 years were perhaps the most generous and progressive in American history. Of course, none of it would be possible without the Emancipation Proclamation and the stubborn gumption of countless Americans who refused to believe that their country and Constitution did not care about them. They fought and won equality despite enormous pressure from the patriarchy. And from, mind you, despite the white male dominating patriarchy that was emblematic of plantation owners in the South, when it came to passing the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, it was white men who voted to implement those amendments, ratify those amendments, and make that part of our Constitution. So it's not that when I talk about this white male patriarchy, I talk about all white men. No, that's not the case. There are many, many American white men who don't subscribe to this ideology of superiority because they are not mediocre, at least in their minds, in their understanding. And even if they were mediocre, they're aware of what they're capable of and what they're not, and they don't sort of rest on the false crutches of racism to feel better about themselves. That's what the patriarchy is about. By the late 1970s, racist Americans who still hadn't shed their prejudice decided, like their predecessors had with Jim Crow laws, to use the legal system to maintain the racial disparity that helped white Americans while disenfranchising and targeting black Americans. This time around, the laws weren't untethered from the commands of the Constitution. They were woven with constitutional thread, attenuating and stretching the meaning of probable cause in SCOTUS's Terry line of cases, giving government authorities greater access to individuals and their private spaces than the Constitution allows. SCOTUS called the inquiry reasonable suspicion. Incidentally, this is the standard that DHS and ICE are currently using when going after people they think are undocumented immigrants or illegal aliens, as the regime likes to call them. So the playing field is tilted in the government's favor to begin with. It is an unconstitutional slippery slope to begin with, creating greater possibility of law enforcement misconduct and overreach. Disparities are created by interpreting the Constitution differently and finding challenges to the Voting Rights Act. The racial tool of gerrymandering continues to plague our elections, creating voting districts that benefit white rich voters and shut out non-white voters. These fights continue to this day, and underneath them all, there's a fight between America's white patriarchy and every other demographic that seeks prominence in the halls of American power and politics. Because every group that isn't the white patriarchy is a threat to the dominance of whiteness and white culture. That is the reason why, when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, the Tea Party rose up. No matter what Donald Trump says or what former Tea Party members say, the Tea Party was a reflexive response to America's white male patriarchy, to somebody breaching the sanctity of their patriarchy. Somebody non-white had just taken the white man's most guarded office, the presidency of the United States itself. As fate would have it, John Roberts had become Chief Justice right before Obama became president. While Obama infuriated white elitists and gave hope to the rest of America, Chief Justice Roberts began his work to unravel constitutional protections the court's predecessors had written into law 50 years ago. Obama's popularity kept him in office for 2 terms. But the moment that popularity was no longer on the ballot, powerful white men began their pushback against an egalitarian America. Remember when Mitch McConnell refused to consent to Merrick Garland's confirmation to the Supreme Court? That ploy was part of the larger game to fix the Supreme Court for a time when the court would take away rights from Americans. And it did just that with Dobbs over a decade later, and by overruling Roe v. Wade and undoing a woman's right to choose whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. Then you have the ongoing fight with the Affordable Care Act. Republicans want to undo a healthcare legislation that has helped millions of people simply because Obama came up with it. Yet, despite 70 challenges to the law, SCOTUS hasn't been able to fully gut the law, but not for the lack of trying. Today, the Affordable Care Act is probably more at risk than ever before. Republicans are poised to end affordable care subsidies and not replace it with any alternative, causing health care costs to skyrocket for millions of Americans. And even those who are not on plans that are part of the Affordable Care Act program, because people are going to go off of insurance. Less demand for the insurance because people can't afford it means those who can afford it are going to have to pay more to make up for the loss that insurance companies are going to experience. And that's a whole different story. All because a black president came up with a law that helped the poor and working American families. Make no mistake, the right to same-sex marriage is very much on the chopping block. So is the right to contraceptives and any other substantive due process right that finds its origins in Griswold v. Connecticut. Substantive due process rights are rights not explicitly written into the Constitution, but considered part of the penumbra or umbrella of rights that flow from the Bill of Rights as interpreted by the Supreme Court and American history and tradition. Add to that Donald Trump's constant attack against transgender people and SCOTUS's acquiescence on the matter. The more rights that are taken away from marginalized populations, the more secure America's white patriarchy will feel about their position and power in American society. America's MAGA movement reclaimed presidential power in 2016 and again in 2024. Both times he defeated a female candidate. Historians will debate for generations about whether Donald won because elections were held against women and America wasn't ready for a woman president, or whether Donald Trump's wins are more attributable to the pushback against Obama. And Biden's presidency was perceived as an extension of Obama's legacy, and Kamala Harris was seen as a threat to American white patriarchy, much like Obama was, and even more so because she was a multi-ethnic woman. Either way, Donald brought the white male manosphere back into the most powerful office in the world. That is why we see countless memes of Donald Trump owning the libs, even that repulsive video of him literally shitting on Americans from an American jet. And then images of him with his bulging muscles and this ripped body, government posts of a white male America. These are all examples of American white male masculinity refused to accept the hard truth that America is a multicultural, multisexual, multi-ethnic, secular democracy. And if you want to call it a republic, you can call it a republic. That is a story of American masculinity and a small group of people who are now the core of MAGA, who consider themselves Western chauvinists like the Proud Boys and Enrique Tarrio. And that's the extreme of it, but there are many people who use race or who determine eligibility on the basis of race And they've been given that permission back by Donald Trump and Donald Trump's MAGA movement. And so we see a resurgence of the patriarchy. We see a dismissal of having women as presidents when we see that there's this man who is pretending to be a strong man, and clearly he's pretending well enough that he has convinced a significant amount of American people that he is the right person and a white man is the right person for the job. And it is at this point that we as Americans have to ask ourselves what our identity is. We have to again go back to that era from the 50s, 60s, 70s, even up until Obergefell in 2015, as the levers of what they would call conservative, what we know as racist, what we know as sexist, what we know as homophobic, what we know as misogynist practices back into something that is acceptable in American society. Now, that's not making America great. That's being regressive. That's taking America back. That's taking America back 100 years. That's taking America back past suffrage, past World War I. That's taking America back from a time where there were no rights for anybody but white men. Women were chattel, black people were slaves and savages. Native Americans were savages who had to be driven out of the land, as was portrayed by artists and now adopted by Donald Trump as part of his propaganda campaign. So we're seeing a reversion to a very, very racist history at a time when we are on the cusp of moving forward with so many with technologies and building a global world where that level of white male patriarchy and patriarchal dominance simply is not going to cut it with the populace. And Donald Trump is not going to be president the next 4 years. No matter what people talk about the 22nd Amendment, he's not going to be able to defeat a constitutional amendment. He's not, and the court is not going to let him get by trying to skirt the 22nd Amendment or the 12th Amendment. So now it is our duty to go back to those times where people pushed, where people shoved. Now, I don't mean literally. I mean through our words, through our actions that are peaceful, through our practices of building community like African Americans did, even when they were enslaved, to be able to bring back that tradition of peaceful resistance, of being able to bring back that power of building community across a city, across a voting district, across a state, and across the nation. That is not based on racial politics or the subtext of American white male masculinity, which plays a big part. We talk about the manosphere. Dr. Heather Cox Richardson talks about the cowboy culture. These are all part of the masculinity aspect that white American men who have identity crises about who they are and whether they are better than others or not, they're not. Only they can only prove that through merit, and merit is not color-based, it's colorblind. And until they accept that, they're going to stay in this swamp swirling around about feeling good about themselves and trying to dominate the world that is very much unlike them and moving forward without them. And we're seeing that happening in America, not just with our fundamental rights, with the detentions, with our trans attacks, with police state operations, with surveillance state operations. We're also seeing that breakdown happen with America retreating from the world in this global age when everybody is connected by the internet and everybody is connected by lightning fast communication. Everybody's moving towards renewable technology and more human rights for the people, and cryptocurrency and artificial intelligence, and we're trying to leap forward. Elon Musk, famous for his white superiority complex, is the richest man in the world. So I guess you could say that the white man dominates the world right now if you were to think about wealth in terms of US dollars, but he's also undermining American stability by burning up American dollars in the process. He's also getting subsidies from the taxpayers, and the taxpayers aren't getting anything back in investment from his companies other than burnt rockets, and holds exclusively for Tesla vehicles in random cities around the country. And we'll see the merits of his actions. Maybe there is a greater plan that includes going to Mars, and he's going to be on the first spaceship to Mars, because he should be the first person, the white man, to land on Mars and build a home there and stay there. With that said, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.